Welcome to today's episode. In this interview, Jonas joins Claus to discuss the growing threat of supply chain attacks and their potential impact on critical infrastructure. Welcome, Jonas.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I think it's important that we define the terms critical infrastructure and why this is important when we discuss cybersecurity and supply chain. Critical infrastructure refers to systems, assets, networks that are essential for functioning of a society and its economy. These infrastructures are vital for smooth operations of a country, ensuring delivery of essential services and supporting various sectors such as energy, transportation, communication, finance, healthcare, and government services. Critical infrastructure typically includes, but is not limited to, energy infrastructure such as power, generation facilities, electricity grids, oil and gas pipelines, etc. Then we have transportation infrastructure, which is usually highways, bridges, airports, seaports, railways, public transit systems, etc. Communication infrastructure such as telecommunication networks, internet service providers, and satellite communication systems. Water and waste systems, water treatment plants, reservoir distribution, and so on. Then we have the financial infrastructure, such as banks, stock exchanges, payment systems, and clearinghouses. Healthcare infrastructure, such as hospital, clinics, medical supply chains, and so on. And last but not least, we also have government infrastructure, which is emergency services, law enforcement, agencies, military installations, and so on. The disruption or damage to critical infrastructure, as you can imagine, can have severe consequences, including economic losses, public safety risks, and societal upheaval. Protecting and securing critical infrastructure is of utmost importance to ensure stability, resilience, and well-being of a nation. And for this reason, I invited Jonas in today to come here and talk about not only critical infrastructure, but equally important, the overall supply chains that's associated with critical infrastructure. So with that in mind, let's get down to it and get Jonas in so that he can share some of his valued experience in this area. So the first question that I have for Jonas is, can you explain the concept of a supply chain attack and why it is considered a growing threat in the context of critical infrastructure?
Thanks. Supply chain cyber attacks usually exploits the chain, so to say, of one or many suppliers. And it's usually some kind of relationship based on trust in some cases, and in some cases not. And the supply chain or the need of some tools, or it could also be, for example, third-party library software or hardware. And the attacks can be done, for example, using automated software updates. It could be water holing attacks. And when it comes to critical infrastructure, for example, there's only a few types of suppliers.
Great. So what are some of these specific examples of recently supply chain attacks that have critically targeted critical infrastructure?
I can name a few examples. At least here in Sweden, we have this Coop attack.
Right.
That was our big grocery store here. And the attackers was actually not targeting Coop, but they were targeting another customer. And Coop was just collateral damage, so to say, in this case. There was also this SolarWinds Orion attack that used an automatic update software. We don't really know who was the target and who was behind the attacks.
Right.
But what people think is that it was against U.S. government agencies that was the target in this case. And when it comes to, for example, protecting against backdoors inserted into automatic software updates, it's really hard to mitigate and do something about it. But we will talk a little bit more about that later on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and another example that was in 2017 was NotPetya, that used an Ukrainian tax software that all the companies that needed to do businesses with Ukrainian companies needed to install this software, and the software had an part that was destructive. It was masked as ransomware, but the actual restoring part of the ransomware wasn't available. So it was only the destructive part, so to say.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that all of these attacks, though I'm sure that the party who started these attacks at the end of the day had a thought process to why they did these things, and but regardless of intent, the thing that scares, I think, most of us is that if they get hold of these critical infrastructures, as you said, so like let's say, for instance, government utilities or even military type of communication or things like that. So if you are, in a time of war, or cyber attacks can be also used in a war context, and it becomes quite scary, in my opinion, that what is considered many times as annoying or a potential financial loss. When we talk about critical infrastructure, we're suddenly talking about putting a country under threat, or at least making it difficult for the country to operate as a whole. And with some of the examples you mentioned, I think it's pretty, interesting from a negative perspective that, attacks can have such a negative effect on society as a whole.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to critical infrastructure, as I mentioned before, there are only usually a few suppliers. Take, for example, power grid stations. There isn't really that much providers, and also when it comes to critical infrastructure, the procurement process is quite open, at least here in Sweden, or at least it used to be quite open. So you could find out pretty much information about the systems, the software, the vendors, etc. And so it gives an advance on information to an attacker.
Right. Yeah, which brings me on to my next question. In your opinion, what are the critical vulnerabilities in supply chains that make them attractive targets for cyber criminals?
Yeah, I think it's multiple things. First of all, it's quite complex area because usually software projects, IT projects these days, they rely on several vendors. They rely on different thousands and thousands of third-party libraries or tools or software, and it could be quite hard to like do an inventory and keep update or keep track on all the third-party software that you're using, and hardware, as I mentioned also before. And it's also hard to have this like visibility or insight into all the third-party software or libraries or tools that you're using, or that you might have contractors that are using these tools. And yeah, so it gets quite complex pretty fast, and I think that's why third-party attacks has a rise in the recent years.
Yeah, and I think that this brings me on to another interesting follow-up questions to that. So, if it is that it's so difficult to manage, and just as a segue, one of these EU directives called NIS2 that is coming into effect next year actually tries to address this supply chain issue. Not necessarily that they give you the solution to how to manage it, but rather will penalize the company who does not ensure that their supply chain is actually up to par. And if the supply chain is attacked, they are seen as actually the culprit in guarding their cybersecurity threat. So they are responsible for the entire supply chain. So How can you actually make sure that you guard yourself against these type of vulnerabilities if it is so complex?
Yeah, I think you need to work on several layers of defense, and you need to think about, as I mentioned, the relationships and the inventory. You need to make sure that all the software you are using is from, or at least as hard as you can, make sure that it's from a legitimate source.
Right.
So if you're downloading from GitHub, for example, or if you're using third-party libraries, how can we be certain that to a different level, so to say, that this software that we're using is there a backdoor?
Right.
And do we have the time to like audit all the code, audit all the third-party code? Probably not.
No.
And if there's a backdoor in this code that we're using, or this IT project that we're using, how can we make sure that the consequences of a backdoor are as small as possible? One thing that you can do is, of course, isolate the software they're using. And these days we use a lot of container technologies to isolate software. So, for example, if you have running on a container that only needs to read files, for example, you can make sure you have a policy for this container that only can read files in a certain folder, so to say. And there's no need to do network communication, for example.
Right.
And as I mentioned, also validate the origin and see if there's like checksums or something like that, so you can validate the source. And also you need to really think about if you need to use a third-party library. If we take the log4j vulnerability as an example, or the library that had log4j library that had this vulnerability, it was a Java logging library, and it had a lot of features built into it. And if you're programming or developing a software project using Java, and you only need to like one feature, you could actually do it yourself instead of importing and using a third-party library that has tons and thousands of different features.
Right. Yeah. And
I also think that you should have a policy on how to use third-party tools, software libraries, and that's also one thing I think it's important.
Yeah. No, I think you bring out a good point, which is that when you either with your suppliers and, or in this case, as you were talking about, library suppliers in the sense of bringing in additional code into your own code, but also if you work with suppliers that has their own software component as a whole, you can no longer just blame them from their inabilities. You need to take that responsibility on yourself, and you have to make sure that you, as you said, these are trusted sources. You know, because at the end of the day, the cyber criminal will find a way, and if they can do that in one of those libraries, as you mentioned, Log4j, if you find a vulnerability there, even if it is that you never in general your code is good, but a third-party library that you import into for a functionality, suddenly you're vulnerable for something that you can't really say was entirely your own fault, but it becomes you that is vulnerable, and you that actually end up potentially with losing data or whatever the attack intended. So supply chain is critical, and again, as we talked about before, related to critical infrastructure, this also goes for any government office or financial services or others that has critical infrastructure in place, that a lot of thought goes into the choice of third-party components and supplier in general. So how can supply chain attacks potentially impact critical infrastructure, and what are the potential consequences of such attacks on the broader society?
I think I mentioned it before, insertion of backdoors, for example. If there is a backdoor inserted and might be a war coming up or something like that, we can think about a different state actor or APT, advanced persistent threat, inserting a backdoor in so they can shut off parts of the power grid, for example, or large parts of the power grid. There's also, of course, ransomware attacks that could take place also. Information theft, loss and breaches is, of course, also a problem. And, of course, loss of money is always, money is really strong motivation behind many of these attacks. And also what we see in some cases is that third-party libraries and packages such as PyP, where people insert backdoors and trying to get bug bounty money when people from Google or Facebook, for example, is developing something and they running these packages when they're using typo squatting. So if someone using a third-party library, but they mispronounce or they miss a letter and they actually getting some other package, and this other package might have a backdoor in it. And then the people trying to get bug bounty because it was run inside Facebook, for example, or run inside Google.
Right. Yeah, no, and again, I think I mentioned earlier, but the fact that, if there is a government out there or an entity out there who wants to take cyber warfare to the next level, they could be planting these backdoors, as you refer to, over a longer period of time into critical infrastructure in the intended target, and may or may not use them ever. But if they feel one day that they want to go after their enemy, as in per their eyes, they suddenly have these open doors into, as you pointed out, maybe turning off the electricity grid or other type of critical infrastructure that suddenly makes the country much more vulnerable, maybe not only for a cyber attack, but even if it's actually on the ground warfare, because you suddenly don't have the basic services in place that enables maybe communication or food or water or etc. So, yeah. One more question from me. What, from a cybersecurity standpoint, what are some of the best practices that organizations should follow to enhance their resilience against supply chain attacks and protect their critical infrastructure effectively?
I would say it's keep an inventory of all your stuff. Know what third-party tools, libraries you're using. Know what types of hardware you're buying and using, firmware, for example. So you really have like this insight into all your third-party, all your tools, software libraries, firmware, hardware, etc. I would say that's the best start, and you can work from there. And then you can do, for example, usual cyber hygiene, for example, keeping them updated. And you should think about how can we update them and how is our process for updating these things that we have. And also, as I mentioned, isolate is also important, and also try to keep an insight or keep an eye so you can see if this software misbehaves somehow. Okay, so this software only should do automatic updates in this manner. If the software is doing something else, how can we get alert about this? And as I mentioned, also third-party libraries that you're using, really think about, should we use them? Have a policy for importing and using third-party libraries. And so you also can keep track of new vulnerabilities, for example, or if the software vendors stops the software or the company got bought, for example, if there's structure changes within the company, these things could also happen. So there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to supply chain cybersecurity.
Yeah. No, and I think one of the things that you pointed out that I think is quite interesting is that it's not just a matter of say just installing and that's it and using. It's as much, as you mentioned, related to policies and configuration, for lack of a better word, I mean, when you use something, make sure that you apply those policies that you have. Make sure that they are configured so that they can only do, as you said, contain them to what they're intended to do, and then monitor these proactively so that they don't start doing things that they weren't supposed to. Because in reality, what we're saying is that you can't really trust that a third-party library will work or never gets vulnerable or is not updated according to your policies. You need to enforce your policies and your container onto the third party or to the supply chain, thereby ensuring that they follow your rules, and just not assume that they are as stringent or as reliable or as well configured as you are.
Yeah.
Great.
I also would like to add that you should also shut down or disable the stuff
That's right.
that you aren't using, because most software these days support a lot of different features and functions. Make sure that you turn off or disable the functions that you are not using, and of course follow the hardening guidelines from the vendors,
Right.
to mention. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Jonas, for joining me here today. And as always, any one of you who is joining into this video, do share your thoughts and ideas for future videos. You can do so in the comments of this video, and we'll take those into consideration in regards to future episodes. And of course, like and share this video, and please subscribe to the channel. And with that, thank you very much, Jonas, for joining once again.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining today.